Good morning, everybody. In the link below is in the description below is a link to an article written in 2006 to do with the Ryan Harris case, the case that I looked at yesterday, or was it the day before? I think it was the day before, the one before. Anyway, quite a disturbing case, let's just say that, of two young boys. One apparently was aged 8, one was aged 7, and they arrested them and got a false confession from the pair of them, which the various accounts did not add up. However, in this article, it seems that the boys were both fully compensated by the tune of 2 million and something like 6 million respectively. Unfortunately, they do come from an area of Chicago, I believe it's called the Englewood area, where there are just so many convicted felons in that area of all types, that unfortunately it would appear that one of them in particular has gone particularly off the rails. Of course, one cannot but suspect that, you know, being charged with such a violent crime, horrible crime, the way being treated by the police detectives, maybe that caused it. I'm not going to conjecture any further. I'll let you read the article. I'm hoping to get some more clarification on the case. Anyway, as promised, we're going to move on with, hopefully I'm going to do 2 videos today. The other one, particularly interesting, to do with Mr. Kassan, Saul Kassan, who has sent me some interesting emails and links to various things, and so we'll have a look at the Huey Burton case later on. Anyway, carrying on with section 2. This is page, I believe it's 87. Yeah, 87. So we're getting very close to the end. There's 114 pages altogether. Anyway, why don't I get on and read what I should be doing, which is section 2. Multiple innocent defendants arrested, charged and convicted based on co-defendants' false confession. Well, that's certainly the case with Brendan and Steve, isn't it? In several of the cases in our database, a false confession not only led to the wrongful arrest, prosecution and conviction of the confessor, it also led to the wrongful arrest, prosecution and conviction of co-defendants who were named in the false confession. In this way, a single false confession can have a cascade-like effect, embroiling numerous other innocents in its net. Perhaps the most dramatic example of this is the Lori Roschetti murder and rape case in Chicago. So this is item A. Calvin Ollins, Larry Ollins, Marcellus Bradford and Omar Saunders. Lori Roschetti, a medical student at the University of Illinois, Chicago's Rush Medical School, was raped and murdered on October the 18th, 1986. She was last seen driving to her West Side apartment about 1 o'clock in the morning after a late night of studying for exams. 4 hours later, her body was found by a Chicago and Northwestern Railway officer on a desolate stretch of access road near the IABLA Homes Public Housing Development. Roschetti's face had been nearly destroyed by a chunk of concrete, and an autopsy later revealed that she had been kicked so hard and so many times that most of her ribs had been fractured. Tests later determined that she had also been sexually assaulted. The sheer savagery of the crime sent shockwaves throughout Greater Chicago and created intense pressure on the Chicago police to solve the crime. Pressure which reached a fever pitch as days, then weeks, and then months passed without an arrest. Nearly 3 months after Roschetti's death, and seemingly out of leads, Chicago detectives turned to a noted FBI profiler, Robert Ressler, and asked him to create a profile of the man or men who had killed Roschetti. His review of the evidence led Ressler to conclude that the crime was committed by between 3 and 6 young black males aged 15 to 20 who had previously been incarcerated and lived close to the scene of the abduction and the spot where Roschetti's body had been found. Ressler theorized that these young men had blocked the path of Roschetti's car, opened a car door, forced Roschetti out of the driver's seat, and then took her to the access road where they raped and killed her. Using Ressler's profile, the Chicago police zeroed in on 3 black teenagers, Marcellus Bradford, Larry Ollins, and Omar Saunders, all of whom lived in the nearby housing project and had spent some time in juvenile facilities. On January 27th, detectives brought the young men in for questioning. Over 15 hours later, in the early morning hours of January the 28th, police claimed that Bradford confessed, implicating himself, Larry Ollins, and Larry's cousin, Calvin Ollins, a 14-year-old who lived outside of the neighborhood at the Cabrini Green housing project on Chicago's near north side. The alleged motive for the murder and rape, a robbery to obtain bus fare so that Calvin could return home to Cabrini Green. Detectives then immediately went to Calvin Ollins' home, woke him up, took the learning disabled boy to the station house and grilled him until they obtained a confession. There are no recordings of the interrogations of Bradford or Ollins, but both have since maintained that police officers threatened them, beat them, lied to them about the strength of the evidence against them, and then presented them with papers containing details of how the police theorized the murder took place and rehearsed the story with them before bringing in a prosecutor to memorialize their statements. Bradford agreed to sign the statement and to testify against Larry Ollins because he was promised a 12-year sentence instead of a life sentence, a deal which prosecutors later honoured and one that ultimately allowed Bradford to be released after serving only about 6 years in prison. Calvin Ollins claimed he signed the statement because he was first shown his cousin and told that Larry had fingered him in the murder, and then led to believe he would be allowed to go home if he signed the statement. Bradford, age 17, testified against Larry Ollins at Ollins' trial. Based largely on Bradford's testimony, which he has since admitted was a lie, Larry Ollins was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Omar Saunders and Calvin Ollins were also convicted and sentenced to life in prison. In addition to the statements, the convictions were secured through erroneous and possibly perjurious testimony by Pamela Fish, a lab analyst at the Chicago Crime Lab who testified that semen samples could have come from the defendants. Pamela Fish gave this testimony knowing that the recovered samples indicated that the perpetrators were secretors, meaning their blood type could be determined from the semen and other bodily excretions like saliva and not just their blood, and that the defendants were all non-secretors. Police also secured the testimony of 2 snitch witnesses, Sam Bush and Anthony Guilty, to build their case against the boys. Bush testified that Saunders, before he was arrested, had admitted to him that he was involved in the killing. Similarly, Guilty testified that Larry Ollins told him at a party that he was involved in Roschetti's murder. Both have since recanted, with Bush claiming he only agreed to testify falsely against Saunders when police threatened to trump up charges against him, and Guilty claiming that police threatened to charge him with Roschetti's murder, and then prosecutors agreed to grant him leniency on pending burglary charges. In words which would later turn out to be prophetic, Calvin Ollins made a final statement in open court before being led away to serve a life sentence. He wrote, apparently he said, "I want to say that I was found guilty for something that I didn't do. And I will always tell myself that I will be out one day and that God will do something for me." After serving nearly 15 years in prison for the murder of Laurie Roschetti, new DNA testing, which confirmed the inaccuracy of Pamela Fisher's testimony and failed to link any of the four men to the murder and rape of Roschetti, led prosecutors to agree that the four should be released. On December the 6th, 2001, Calvin and Larry Ollins, Omar Saunders were freed from prison. After the first DNA test results appeared to exonerate the four men, Chicago Police Department Deputy James Muir, the commander of the homicide unit that investigated Roschetti's murder, still insisted to reporters that the men were guilty. Quote, "Perhaps they wore condoms or perhaps they didn't ejaculate in her. Whether they left evidence, that I don't know. I'm very confident that they got the right guys." Quote, Moore also speculated that a fifth man might have been involved, a statement which directly contradicted the trial testimony of one of the lead detectives who deemed such a possibility a fiction. Patrick O'Brien, the former Cook County State's attorney who prosecuted the men in 1988, told reporters on the day the men were released, "There is always the possibility of false confessions, but in my mind they confessed because they did it." It took only 37 days after the men were released for Muir and O'Brien to be proven wrong. Acting on a tip from the brother of one of the true perpetrators, police arrested Dwayne Roach and Eddie Bo Harris. Prosecutors charged the men with the murder and rape of Roschetti after the men gave videotaped confessions. DNA and fingerprint evidence later linked them to the crime scene. Larry Ollins, Calvin Ollins, Omar Saunders, and Marcus Bradford have since filed a wrongful conviction lawsuit against the city of Chicago and individual police officers and prosecutors who were involved in the initial Roschetti murder investigation. Just a quick Section 3. Multiple false confessions from same defendants to multiple crimes, the so-called serial killer cases. So-called serial killings played a critical role in several of the false confession cases studied in the course of this article's preparation. Specifically, the belief that a serial killer was at large had a corrupting effect on police investigations in at least two ways. One, police officers labelled innocent men as serial killers after obtaining false confessions from them to multiple killings, only to learn later that the true perpetrator was a serial killer who had remained at large. Two, police officers obtained true confessions to murders and rapes from suspects and then attempted to close cases by pinning other unsolved crimes on the suspect. In several of these cases, the so-called serial killer was not guilty of one or more of the crimes to which he had confessed. Perhaps the most dramatic case in the first category is the case of Jerry Frank Townsend, a mentally disabled man who spent 20 years in the Florida prison system for murders and rapes committed by other men. Serial killer and rapist Eddie Lee Mosley. Another man, Frank Lee Smith, was also wrongfully convicted of a rape murder since attributed to Mosley. Smith was not as lucky as Townsend. He died of cancer on Florida's death row before he could taste his freedom. So, Section A. Innocents who falsely confess to crimes committed by serial killers. Jerry Frank Townsend, Frank Lee Smith, and Eddie Lee Mosley. Jerry Frank Townsend was born in Greensville, Mississippi, the son of a sharecropper. At 14, Townsend, who has an IQ of between 50 and 60, quit school in the 5th grade and went to the fields to pick cotton, beans, and corn. As he grew older, he took odd jobs washing cars, lifting freight, doing janitorial work, and travelling with Hoaxie Brothers Circus as a labourer. Bosses repeatedly said he was a good hard worker. He had a wife and a daughter in Chicago, but lived in Hollandale Beach, Florida, and washed cars for a living. In 1979, at age 27, he worked at a Miami equipment company, opening boxes. In the summer of 1979, 4 women were murdered in 4 weeks in Broward County and Miami-Dade County, Florida. The victims, all black females, were attacked in or near their homes and on the street. Some were on their way to work or returning from parties or choir practice. Most of them were raped and then strangled. Young women responded to the deaths by arming themselves with switchblades, and young men formed vigilante mobs. After the daylight rape of a woman on a Miami-Dade sidewalk in September 5th, 1979, the police arrested Jerry Frank Townsend. The victim and 2 witnesses identified Townsend a block away from the incident. Although the victim had a criminal history, declined to go to a rape treatment centre following the alleged incident and never testified against Townsend. Townsend quickly became a suspect in several unsolved murders. Detectives investigating the rape asked Townsend about unsolved murders in Miami and Fort Lauderdale. At the end of 4 days of questioning, Townsend had implicated himself in about 20 homicides in Fort Lauderdale, Miami, Tampa, and San Francisco. Although prosecutors did not pursue most of Townsend's confessions because there was evidence that he could not have committed them, he was still charged with 6 murders. No physical evidence ever linked Townsend to any murder, and his rambling, confused confessions on audio tape showed telltale signs he was led and coerced by his interrogators. According to one expert, the frequent stop and start interruptions of the tape, as well as the detectives' frequent prompts and correction of Townsend on tape, render Townsend's statements so flawed as to be worthless for establishing guilt. Many of the details he included were wrong, including given the inaccurate races and ages of some of the victims. He was also 6 years off on the date of one murder and wrongly described some of the victims' clothing. In one interview on September the 9th, 1979, Townsend described killing several women in orange groves near Tampa, telling police he strangled one with his hands, another with her bra, and cut the throat of a third. The next day, again on tape, Townsend completely changed the manner of death, telling detectives he shot all 3. This guy, Townsend, was capable of confessing to just about anything, said Dennis Urbano, who was the public defender in Miami-Dade at the time, and defended Townsend on his Miami-Dade charges. We tried it out and we could get him to confess to anything. Police led Townsend through the confessions after spending hours talking to him about the cases, Urbano said. They wanted to clean out and cold case files on him. At moments in the taped confession, Townsend seemed to be recounting crime details while looking at crime scene photos provided by police. Detectives also took Townsend to Dillard High School in 1979 to talk about the murder of 13-year-old Sonia Yvette Marion. Townsend said it was a white female and he did it at night, said Doug Evans, a retired police detective who worked on the Marion murder. But it was a black child and it was during the day. I knew he didn't do it. In 1980, Townsend stood trial for 3 first-degree murders, the 1973 deaths of Thelma Jean Bell, Naomi Gamble and Barbara Ann Brown. At trial, the judge allowed prosecutors to introduce evidence from 2 murders from 1979, including the Sonia Yvette Marion murder, as part of a pattern theory. After a 4-week trial on July 30, 1980, based almost entirely on his flawed confessions, the jury found Townsend guilty of the first-degree murders of Gamble and Brown and not guilty of the Bell murder. He was given 2 consecutive life sentences with 25-year minimums before consideration for parole. On October the 4th, 1982, he pleaded no contest to the second-degree murders of Terry Cummings and Kathy Moore. He also pleaded guilty on December the 6th, 1982, to the 1977 murder of Dorothy Gibson and the 1979 murder of Wanda Verga in Miami. Finally, Townsend pleaded guilty to a rape in Miami, primarily because investigators told him he would get the death penalty if he refused to confess. In total, Townsend was held responsible for 6 murders, 4 in Broward County and 2 in Miami-Dade County, and was serving 7 life sentences. After reviewing crime scene evidence in 1998, Detective John Curcio of the Fort Lauderdale Police Department reopened 3 closed 1979 murder cases that had been pinned on Jerry Frank Townsend. Detective Curcio requested that the Broward County Sheriff's Crime Lab examine DNA evidence from the crime scenes. Curcio sought the testing because he had long suspected that the rapes and murders for which Townsend was convicted were the work of Eddie Lee Mosley, a man whom Broward County authorities had labelled the Rape Man, and whom they believed was responsible for approximately 41 rapes and 17 rape murders between 1973 and 1987. Although it took 2 years to locate and test the DNA evidence, Curcio's suspicions proved to be true. The DNA in the cases of the 1973 murder of Naomi Gable and the 1979 slaying of Terry Cummings cleared Townsend and implicated Mosley. Mosley, and not Townsend, also raped and killed Sonia Yvette Marion. 3 other murders attributed to Townsend were re-examined, but no DNA could be found for testing. Faced with the DNA evidence, a Broward County judge cleared Townsend of the 4 Broward County murders, prompting Broward County Sheriff Ken Jen to offer Townsend a personal apology. That's really interesting. That is the first time I think I've ever come across a sheriff department actually offer the victim an apology. Sheriff Herman never offered, 1983, Ken Peterson, never, ever, Tom Koshuret never offered Stephen Avery an apology. Robert Herman could barely come to terms with the fact that, it was the 1985 wrongful conviction case was unfortunate. But that's absolutely amazing. So well done to Sheriff Ken Jen to offer Townsend a personal apology. Although Miami-Dade State's Attorney Catherine Fernandez Rundle released a statement saying, in part, that she still believed that Townsend was a rapist and a murderer based on evidence she reviewed. A Miami-Dade judge eventually vacated Townsend's 3 convictions in Miami, calling the sentence an enormous tragedy. Townsend was released on June the 16th, 2001, after 22 years in prison. Eddie Lee Mosley's modus operandum was to rape women and strangle them with an article of clothing. Most of the victims lived within a mile of where Mosley lived with his mother. Although Broward police knew of Mosley's location, they were unable to send him to prison. In 1974, a judge sent Mosley to a mental hospital after he was ruled incompetent to stand trial on a 1973 rape charge. On June the 4th, 1979, Mosley was released from an institution for the criminally insane, and within months the string of rapes and killings started again. Lisa Wakeman, a Miami rape victim, tentatively identified Mosley, not Townsend, as her attacker in a photo lineup, further remarking that her attacker had, quote, nice teeth, an important piece of evidence in light of the fact that Townsend was missing many of his. In court, Wakeman waffled, first denying that Townsend looked like her attacker and then insisting he was the man. I can't be sure, but he looks like him. If he was a little darker, I'd say it was him. Later, she was asked if Townsend was the man, and she said, I don't know. Mosley was charged with rape again in 1980 and 1984, but again he beat the charges. At least 9 other women were raped and murdered after Townsend was arrested in 1979, including 22-year-old Teresa Giles, raped and strangled in December 1984, and 54-year-old Emma Cook, found raped and strangled in a deserted concrete shed on Christmas Eve of 1983. During his incarceration, Townsend lived in constant fear for his life. He was classified as a maximum security prisoner, requiring that he be handcuffed during any activity and that all the activities outside his cell be extremely limited. Perhaps more importantly, his convictions involved the rape and murder of a child, a crime that guards and inmates especially disliked. As a sex offender, prison regulations limited visitations with family members and barred any visits with his young daughter. After his release on June 15, 2001, he showed signs of being affected by 22 years in prison. He now walks slowly with his head down and his shoulders stooped. He constantly looks behind him as if he expects to be ambushed. When 8-year-old Sandra Whitehead was found raped and murdered in a home in 1986, police used sketchy and conflicting eyewitnesses' accounts to pick up Frank Lee Smith, an eccentric man living near the scene of the crime. Smith, previously convicted of 2 murders, one at age 13, one at 18, was somewhat infamous in the neighbourhood and seemed to be the perfect suspect. An interrogation by 2 decorated police detectives was neither videotaped or tape recorded, and so no notes were found from the interview. According to the detectives' statements, however, Smith made, several were damning admissions. One detective, Richard Sheff, later testified that when he and his partner lied to Smith, saying that the victim's brother had seen the murder, Smith said, "No way that kid could have seen me. It was too dark." This supposed confession was used to convict Smith for Whitehead's murder, in spite of the fact that no physical evidence implicated him, and information given by eyewitnesses made it highly improbable that Smith could have been the perpetrator, i.e. Smith was legally blind and could not have hopped a fence without his glasses. Several witnesses swore the perpetrator was not wearing glasses. In 2000, Smith died of cancer while on death row. FBI DNA tests exonerated Smith 1 year later and implicated Eddie Lee Moses, then an inpatient in a state mental institution. Wow, that was very interesting. As I say, let me quickly upload this, and then I've got another one coming which I think you'll find particularly interesting. Some information that was sent to me by none other than Saul Kassan. So anyway, catch you soon. Bye for now.